Okay. Um, Hi, my name is Rashawn, and I am 31 years old. I currently live in Georgia, but I was born in Lexington, Kentucky, and I grew up for several years in Berea, Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky is in central Kentucky, and Berea, Kentucky is a little bit further south, and it's right on the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. My mother is African American, my father's Caucasian, and so we grew up in a relatively mainstream, uh, primarily predominantly Caucasian state. There was very little diversity there, and when they divorced, my mother raised me with her parents, my grandparents in Berea in Richmond, Kentucky, and they were raised as Seventh Day Adventist Christians. And in Kentucky, especially, that is probably the beginning of the Bible Belt. It's definitely the South. And so the predominant religion is pretty much Southern Baptist, definitely heavily Protestant, but very few um, delineations that differ away from Baptist. So to be a Seventh day Adventist was pretty unusual, especially in the 80s, even though my mother was a third generation Seventh day Adventist. In Berea, because we were about 30 miles away from the major city, there was very uh, little interaction with the Adventists because there was so few of us. There was probably less than 25 in the whole church. So there was just one church. So we definitely were pretty peculiar. There was not a lot known about Adventism, and so we were often mistaken for Jehovah's Witnesses because there just wasn't a lot of exposure. People didn't understand. They either knew that there was something peculiar about us, or they just knew that we went to church on a different day other than the mainstream day of Sunday. So, growing up as a kid in Berea in a predominantly white community, and then going to a very small minority type of church was interesting because as a child, um, our worship day wasn't just one day per se of being Saturday. It extended for a period of time. It was worship from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. So as a young person, I was oftentimes ostracized or picked upon because I could not participate in just school activities, and so a lot of things were not a given to accommodate, me. Because of my religious preference, my mother had to work really hard to keep certain jobs because religious tolerance was not a big priority where we were living in rural Kentucky, and they weren't aware that they should give religious um, accommodations for religious freedom. So a lot of education had to be constantly um, fought and discovered and given to people. When I was a kid, my mom had to constantly work with the school because they didn't want to accommodate for certain school lunches that were in line with our Adventist health message. And so pork products, we constantly had to just make sure that pork wasn't given. Um, we then moved to Lexington, Kentucky, and that's more of a urban center, but that too still had a lot of narrow-minded, very provincial attitudes because at that time there was only two Seventh-day Adventist churches in Lexington, and one was a primarily white congregate Seventh-day Adventist church, and then the other was a predominantly black congregate church. So even though I was biracial, I went to the predominantly black congregate church, and most people still in that city did not know a whole lot about Adventism. But we definitely got a negative connotation when national news picked up on Seventh day Adventism in the early 90s with the David Koresh Branch Davidian. And in Kentucky, I think a lot of those narrow-minded people definitely started misconstruing and generalizing and stereotyping Adventists even worse during that time. But I think as overall, because of the geographic area of where we are in Kentucky, a little bit more isolated than most urban centers, it's very slow for things to change, especially people's attitudes to change when it comes to something that's not traditional and not the norm, not the mainstream. Um, but when I moved away from Lexington, I moved to Nashville, which is still in the South, very steeped in a lot of tradition, but it was more diverse because there was more minorities, there was more African Americans, and increasingly a even large, emerging Hispanic population. So there was more tolerance because you had more people to think about. There was more sensitivity given to being something different, maybe as a different denomination of a Christian like Seventh Day Adventist. So I did not see nearly the prejudice or indifference that I may have seen in Kentucky and Nashville. And then as I moved further to Atlanta, I definitely, as an adult, I don't see that because there's so many more Seventh Day Adventist churches, white and black. There's just so many more cultures in general that a rural place like Kentucky, especially in the Appalachia, because of its geographic constraints, it's just not able to accommodate. So when you're kind of closed off in a more remote place like the rural Appalachia, you definitely, unfortunately, have a more closed view of the world because you're very guarded in how you want to preserve what little things that you do have. And so you're very cautious and skeptical about anything that's not familiar. And so when you kind of get away from that and you're more open and you're in a bigger environment and you have to change and trade different cultures and ideas, I think that's when I at least was able to see more open-mindedness and positive attitudes toward being biracial, being Seventh Day Adventist, being something that wasn't just the typical mainstream um, culture. So that's my opinion. That's my particular understanding. That's my viewpoint from growing up in Kentucky and leaving and coming to the big city.